You would think that the people of this particular town, Gerasa perhaps, the region of the Gerasenes, would have appreciated what Jesus had done for them. No longer did they need to worry about this demon-possessed person who threatened them. And yet their response to Jesus is anything but gratitude. They are frightened. And in their fear, they ask Jesus to leave. Ironically, they want to cast Jesus out. We hear in the story that the man has been the terror of the village for a long time. They've tried to keep him in chains and in shackles. They've guarded him. Yet he continually breaks free. Finally, the demons drive him out into the wilds, the desert, and he lurks around out there without clothing, living in the tombs, until that moment when Jesus sets him free. Now, the community is not the first to show fear. If you were reading carefully, you noticed that it was the demons who showed fear first in our text. They tried to keep him in place. Leave us alone, they say. Stop tormenting us, they say. The encounter follows a pattern of stories of exorcisms. Now, for us, that may seem like an odd sort of thing, but I would like to kind of translate what that might mean for us in our everyday kind of lives. It's the naming of things, the engagement of those things, the expelling of those things, and the description of the one who is set free. So naming, engagement, casting out or expelling, and the description of what freedom looks like. I think it's really the pattern of what it's like when we face anything that is quite large in our lives, any kind of true change in us or from us. First, the powers that need to be exercised are things that need to be named. Now, getting powers named is not always an easy thing, is it? The reality of denial is nothing new. Say to an addicted person, you're an addict, and you might as well be saying it to the wall. The first response is just complete denial. In the last month, I've watched 2 movies that have, although they're very different stories and about very different things, the themes are similar, contemporary stories about the difficulty of speaking truth to people who are, content or happy or people that are in power. These movies were Spotlight and Concussion. Maybe you've seen them. In both stories, the powerful or the content or the fans don't want to hear about the truth about pre-sexual misconduct and child abuse in the case of Spotlight, or in the NFL Football League doesn't want to hear about the fact that their sport is causing traumatic brain injury, significant disorders, early death, hastened by a maddening form of dementia, and often preempted by suicide. Getting powers to be named is not an easy thing to do. And yet naming is essential for engagement. Have you ever figured something out to the point where you were able to name it for yourself? A conflict that you have with someone and suddenly it kind of clicks into place. Oh, it's this. And from that moment on, you can't see it in another way. That name begins the possibility to engage whatever's going on in that relationship. And naming is essential for engagement. Jesus asked the demons to name themselves, and they said, we're too many to name, it'll take too long. Let's just call us legion. A legion is a couple thousand troops. What kind of power is present when we invite people to name their own problem? It's the power, the potential, the promise of engagement. It's the beginning of the battle, not the end, but it's that moment of clarity where we see for the first time and perhaps will not be able to go back. Now, the demons thought that they have caught Jesus up, and by allowing them to go into the swine. Now, I know, how many of you are feeling bad for the pigs? Nobody? Come on, there's always somebody who feels bad for the pigs. Of course. Yeah. They think that fleeing in this way is their opportunity to be free. But we have to remember the context, and you don't get that by a Sunday reading. You have to kind of read all of Luke, is that what has just happened is Jesus steps on their shore. Do you know where he stepped on the shore from? A boat. And that boat was on the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus has just calmed the powers of the sea. Who is this who even calms the seas and the winds, the disciples will say. In other words, this place in the vision of ancient mind of the sea as the place of the Leviathan, the place where maybe evil roils up, is a place that Jesus has just dominated, the place that Jesus has just proclaimed victory over. So they believe they're getting away with something when Jesus has already conquered that territory. The demons are named, they are engaged, and then they are cast out. And this is the process of exercising anything in our life: naming, engagement, casting out. If we think about demons as maybe anything that oppresses, I know demons are sort of an interesting thing today. If we polled the congregation, I would think we would have some people who believe in sort of actual demons, and some people that would be like, I'm not so sure about that. But demons in the ancient world represented oppression, anything that oppressed in an evil sort of way. And so perhaps this story becomes clearer if we see this life as one that is completely overwhelmed and overrun by oppression, less wrapped in maybe the supernatural packaging that maybe some of us just have a hard time seeing or understanding. I'm asked regularly if I believe in the demonic, and I say, no, I don't believe in that. I believe in God. But I do see this kind of oppression in people. I believe in that kind of demonic overriding that happens in people's lives. We see it all the time. It's not the little guy in the pitchfork with the horns kind of demonic. I don't know if anybody really believes quite in that anymore. I think instead of whatever works against human beings and creation in a way that lessens the capacity for life. What forces are at work that oppress, and by what means? Sometimes there's systems, family systems, organizational systems, cultural systems. Sometimes it's people themselves, and sometimes it's me and you. Look to the response of those who are present to see what happened. We hear that the swine herders go off and they tell in the city what they have seen, and their reporting is not rejoicing, is it? Well, you can imagine if they were swine herders. They were pig farmers. So part of this is really bad news, terribly bad news. Their report is not one of joy, it's one of panic. So too, those who come out from the city are not joyful or hopeful when they see this man who had been possessed and overwhelmed sitting at the feet of Jesus. They are frightened by this. Why are they frightened? Why will they state to Jesus to get out, in essence, casting him out? How do organizations or families, even ourselves, fear the changes, even good changes, due to what might be the fallout from making changes? Have you ever faced something like that? I'm almost positive you have. You know what the good change needs to be, and yet because of all that may happen in relation to it, we fear to move forward into the change. Jesus comes to speak to those kind of powers in our lives, the things where we get into the crossroads of knowing what the good thing is, but being unable to do it, without capacity or without the courage to be able to move into that kind of future. He's not here to give us Band-Aid type of healings. The cross is certainly not just a simple sort of salve, but a kind of salvation that sort of makes ready the opportunity for something radically new to come up from underneath. He's here to speak to structures, to the powers, to the roots of what make the surface healings necessary in our lives. He wants to speak to unjust systems that keep people oppressed and others blind to the truth. Now, don't be fooled. Powers don't really want to be faced and engaged, and so they'll put up a fight. Any system of understanding, anything organized to provide order for things will not understand questions as an arrangement that's supposed to be gracious. Maybe you felt that. Maybe you're a teacher in a classroom and you have a person who's sort of an alternative thinking type of person, and they're challenging the very structure of the way in which you want to teach and present. And though you might be able to see the opportunity and the good of what's coming forward from what's being said, you have your way. And so you can't make that kind of change. Be it governments or civic organizations or churches or even human beings, questions to the order of the way things are perceived to be, the way we like to have things ordered, is a threat. It's from big things to little. We had this conversation the other day. Where were we? I think it was the 50th anniversary, and somehow we got into the toilet roll question. You know that one. This primordial kind of question, the most ultimate of questions in a marriage, right? Does the toilet roll paper come from the top or from the bottom? And people actually admitted that they would go into bathrooms and change it if people had it the wrong way and you were visiting their home. From the sublime to the ridiculous. We seem to have a grasp on how things should be, and even though the good, the beautiful, and the true might stand on the other side, we're committed to that way. And the good change may be possible, but we are committed to the way things were. And that, I think, is what's at stake with these people in the Gentile region of the Gerasenes, is they understood the devil they had, and they didn't understand the one they had now. And it was threatening and frightening. Walter Wink, as a theologian, says that exorcism is essentially a cleansing of the mind. If we think about Paul's word about how faith comes by hearing and our minds being conformed, we might think so. Cleansing of the mind. We don't always, he says, wish to have our minds cleansed, our understandings questioned, our positions or places challenged. He says, I believe that's why the villagers are not ecstatic about this change. The systems are working fine, thank you very much. May not be perfect, but we found a way to manage, shackles and chains. But so just please leave us alone. Don't threaten our sense of management. Don't remove our excuses for why things must be the way they are. Nobody, one scholar said, nobody likes a good exorcism. Maybe you've had one of those conversations with a friend. Sometimes we call it the come to Jesus conversation. So in and of itself, we recognize what it is. And a trusted friend or mentor in this kind of conversation states a very uncomfortable and penetrating truth about yourself. Ever had that? No? I need to work harder with some of you. Maybe when it's said, you felt that defensiveness and the lash of anger because it was just too painfully close. And so the only opportunity you had was really to push back, to give yourself some breathing room and something that was striking so close to the heart. We don't care for an attempt at exorcism when something is named and we can see almost immediately how much work it's going to take to engage it. And perhaps we move from denial, which is the inability to see, to willful blindness, because engagement takes too much energy in order to change the way things are. Now the man has been set free from this overwhelming possession. He's in his right mind. And so they have to consider him anew. What if this guy moves into our cul-de-sac? Can you feel the edge of it? They cannot easily write him off simply as the problem that needs to be put somewhere else, a sick person or a troubled person, and therefore they can walk away from him and wash their hands of him because they've conveniently shown themselves ontologically in his being that he needs to be over there. But now that he doesn't have to be over there, what are we going to do? They would rather have him be in chains for their comfort than to have his health and become an unknown element in their community. In fact, I'm sure some people will never allow this man to re-enter their community, which is probably one of the reasons why he begged to go with Jesus. And therefore, those people who won't receive him will continue to live in a willful blindness, believing the man to still be possessed and not free. If you're afraid, this is literature, isn't it? Les Miserables. Remember the story? Two main characters, right? Jean Valjean and the police officer, because we can never remember that guy's name, poor guy. Jean Valjean is a man whose life is transformed, and because his life is transformed, he's good through and through, but the police officer who seems to know exactly who this guy is, and he's a rotten egg, in the end is its undoing because he cannot change his perspective. He's possessed by the idea that Jean Valjean is a bad man and will preempt his death. So the man is healed. But will he be welcomed back into community? How long will he serve as a reminder of what has been challenged in that village? Will they attempt to exorcise him from the community as they've just done at the end of our reading with Jesus? What kind of challenge will he find as he attempts to resume his life again, even among his own family? Will they rather live as though he's still not free? This is the potential of the wrath of community. Have you ever seen it? Or of individuals who cannot accept grace when it's given to others. So what becomes of him? Theologian Walter Wink again says, this is a great quote, "The victory of faith over the powers lies not in immunity to their wrath, but in the emancipation from their delusions." Let me do it again, all right? You ready? The victory of faith over the powers lies not in the immunity from their wrath. They're going to be wrathful probably, but you are emancipated from joining their delusions. I wonder what delusions cost the soul. What limits do we immediately accept in life when we accept unchallenged understandings and unanswered questions to the powers of our lives? What kind of victimization of ourselves or others do we accept by buying these illusions? What power do they yield for the agency of choice that we limit of ourselves or others when we accept these delusions? Or choose needless fears, live in ungracious lives, unforgiving, or in our own mythologies about other people when we call them demons? The victory of faith, Walter Wink writes, is emancipation from delusions. The powers may or may not be changed, but we can be free from the delusions that we have seen in our lives and how power functions. Think about some people who've taken on powers and therefore face truth and can engage delusions. People like a Gandhi or a Martin Luther King. You could name people who refused to let delusions of powers define who they were and what excuses they would come up with for accepting the way things were, accepting oppression. They also chose not to let the domination of those powers, the wrath of those communities of power, drive them to bitterness and hatred. Because naming powers and engagement with powers gives us a great opportunity to also not buy their delusion and therefore choose transformation and allow God to exorcise hate from them as well as delusion. In a season of Pentecost, we are challenged to grow. That's the idea of a green season, is that we are supposed to be growing, seeing what Jesus is doing in us as Jesus did on earth in his earthly ministry. May we recognize the demonic that comes at us in a legion of ways, that the delusions of power are deep inside of ourselves, inside of the systems that we accept, and inside of other people. May we not accept the limitation of delusions, our own or others' power. May we be aware of the fear of change. And change, one psychologist says, always feels like death. In the Bible, change always feels like exorcism. And everybody's Lutheran. They don't like change. Both in us and in others. May we recognize that nobody likes a good exorcism, for it proclaims that we always have an alarming amount of choices, and therefore we have an alarming amount of freedom, because we have a God who cannot stand for oppression. And this is the good news of the gospel, that Jesus continues to call us to live beyond the voices of oppression that we generate or that we suffer from. And He calls us to health and life and choice and freedom, because He is the right God for that job. Amen. Folks, let's sing together our sermon response.